A good contract is worth its weight in gold. Are you a creative entrepreneur who contracts your services to others? Well, listen up, because this is for you. The Smithers Law Group has created 14 master contracts specifically for creative entrepreneurs. These contracts are industry specific, they're fully customizable, and you only pay a one-time fee. This is so much better and more affordable than speaking with an attorney who's going to charge you an hourly consultation fee, and it's so much more secure than just Googling up your contract and hoping for the best. Find your fully customizable and industry-specific contract at stulawgroup.com. Search for the contract link. And don't forget to tell them that I sent you.
By and large, like the story of labor organizing, I think is really told from a white perspective. I think if we tell the story of labor organizing in the US by Black people, we would start in 1861.
Welcome to Impostrix Podcast, the space where we talk about the complexities of imposter syndrome narratives as experienced by people of color, and where we talk about navigating the landscape of racial toxicity in our careers. I'm Whitney Knox-Lee. I'm a consultant, an attorney, a mediator, and I'm your host. I'm here on this journey with you toward validation, rootedness, and liberation. Join me and our guests as we share relatable experiences, explore impactful tips and tools, and talk about the complexities of the pursuit of career success as people of color. Here we're becoming rooted in our power together. We're setting aside imposter syndrome, interrupting racial toxicity and racism, and redefining what it means to thrive in our careers. Here, we're being validated. So let's go. Welcome back to Impostrix Podcast. I'm your host, Whitney Knox-Lee, and I'm here with Aime-Josiane, and I'm looking forward to this conversation as usual. And let me just, before I have them introduce themselves, I have a story. I was thinking about starting this podcast about a year ago, and I was reading just some random stuff, articles on one of my favorite resources, which is raceequitytools.com. And one of the articles that I clicked on had something to do with basically folks of color navigating the workspace, and specifically nonprofit workspaces, which was something that I was dealing with. And I was like, I'm here. This person sees me. And so then I read about the author, and this person had lived in Seattle and also had lived in Atlanta and was around my age and had a similar journey. It was basically a reverse journey for me. And it turns out that was AJ's spouse, Nisha. And so I messaged, it was the first time I've ever done this. I've done it a lot since then though. But I messaged Nisha and I was like, hey, I just read your article that's 3 years old at this point, and I love it. We should be friends. And because at that point, y'all were living here. And so I met up with Nisha. Nisha introduced me to their spouse, and here we are now talking with AJ. I love both of them because I get so much fulfillment out of my interactions with you all, and I get a sense of community whenever I'm with y'all. So I'm really happy to have you on the show. It means a lot to me. So welcome, AJ.
Oh, thank you. That's such a sweet story. I love the backstory. And I know that Nisha, my spouse, was also really excited to get a friend on Twitter or something, hey, somebody reach out. And I do agree that piece on decolonizing nonprofits was really, really great. So I'm glad. And then here we are now.
Yes, absolutely. And so I'm going to let you introduce yourself, share with us who you are, what are the identities that you bring to this conversation, and also tell us about your podcast.
Oh my gosh. Okay. That last one. So I'm Aime-Josiane, or AJ, they, them pronouns. I am originally from Rwanda in East Africa, grew up in Central Africa in Zambia, came to the US um, as a kid, spent some time in California, now in Atlanta. I say all of that because when I think about, where home is, it's super complicated. And I had formative experiences in so many different places, which I also think allows me to bring some flexibility in my work because I work with a lot of people. So I've been in Atlanta for most of my adult life with a brief detour in Seattle. And I have been an activist and an organizer, and a creative. So a lot of the work that pays me has been organizing with labor unions or with like a worker center. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then now I train organizers all across the country. It's such a blessing. I'm like, how did I get here? I've made some good choices, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I do that, and then I do some activism locally. I'm definitely still looking for that political home um, that can really hold me down in Atlanta, and yeah, and getting back into my creative pursuits. So I'm doing more of like the the poetry, the music that I was really into. Yeah, over a decade ago. I'm coming back into the things that a younger version of me really um would have appreciated more of. So it's been a journey. And my podcast is called Disciples of Courage. It is, I was actually, this, like, just talking to you pushed me to just come back with it, after a very
Mhm.
long hiatus. And so I'm enjoying that. I think it's really a place for me to make connections between different stories and ideas in my mind, and just really pulling out the lessons about courage. Being a disciple is like being, I'm not Christian, but I grew up in very, religious household, and being a disciple is about being like, you know, um, being like a follower, and like I think of it as like a train the trainer, right? Like, Jesus tells you what's up, and then you go and tell other people what's up. And so I think of discipleship in that way when it comes to courage, of like when we have stories about courage, when we figure out what helps us be courageous, then we should share that with people, because um, you may have the best intentions in the world, but you need the courage to actually carry things through. And so, like, that's, to me, is like the gas, that you put in the tank when you're really trying to go somewhere. But yeah, so making connections, like finding lessons about courage in everyday stories, in mythologies, in reality television. Like, it's just, yeah, it's everywhere.
I really like the podcast because of the stories. One of the things that I'm learning about as a podcaster is including narrative, including stories in my conversations, even though it's a conversational podcast where I'm having guests. And so your show, one of the episodes that I listened to, had a lot of stories around, I think it was mythology. Not I think, it was mythology. But mythology from Rwanda. And for me, that was really cool because I'm not Rwandan. And so for me, it was also like a cultural lesson. And then you were breaking down the 7 types of courage, and that episode was about one of the specific types of courage. And I liked the idea of breaking down courage in that way, because courage is difficult. Like that's the
Hmm.
point. I don't think, like, I don't know if you have courage without difficulty. I think if it's not,
Right.
then I don't,
Then is it courage?
I don't know, maybe, right, right. Not that it's not good or anything, but it's just the part of courage that makes it difficult is the action. And that action, a lot of times, in my experience, isn't something that's necessarily easy. Maybe there's risk involved for myself or for other people. Or, maybe it just requires me going out of my comfort zone. And I think as it relates to, imposter syndrome and race, the topics of this podcast, so much of what we do and how we navigate work environments and career spaces, but also organizing spaces, also social and political spaces, has to do with having courage around our authenticity, around how we're going to show up today, around how we're going to show up in solidarity for others, and whether we are going to, and the way that we are going to. And so, yeah, I encourage people to listen to Disciples of Courage because I think it's a good show.
Thank you. And, you hit on like the key, like one key word, which is risk. A lot of what gets in the way of people being courageous is like that assessment of risk. And, a lot of how we assess risk has to do with the bodies that we inhabit, so I'm like, Black, visibly Black, like unambiguously Black, femme body, non-binary, like, for the most part, able-bodied. So like all of that like comes into play when I'm assessing my risk in any given situation. And I also think that with like any other practice, like practice makes it possible. So like if you practice taking courage in a particular area, then it'll make it easier. Like it won't stop. The risk won't go away. The fear won't go away. But like your capacity to just like move through it is what changes. And for me, the place where I've had the most practice, like my courage lab, has been my work. Because I work in an environment that does require courage. And does require us to help other people access their own. And so, yeah, I think that I'm excited to talk more about, labor and work, because I do think that workplaces are such great, like, practice labs for a lot of the ideas that we have about the world.
Yeah. So let's get into that because so my background with labor unions is that at one of my previous legal employers, I was in a union. I was a dues paying member for like less than half the time I was at that place, a couple of years. The rest of the time, I just sat and chilled and benefited from the union negotiations. So like, my bad. But I still have questions around like, so what's the big deal? Why unions? What do they do for those of us who are members or could be members of unions?
Yeah. So I'll give maybe two responses. The real, like, in my heart response, I am a socialist, and for that reason, I see unions as one of the most direct steps towards the kind of society that I would want to see, the kind of like economic realities that I would want to see, where people are able to control their labor in some way. And, maybe contrary to the current labor movement leaders, I don't think that unions are the end. For me, unions are a means to an end, and that end being, a system whereby people actually do own their labor. So, You can call that a cooperative economy, you can call that a socialist economy, whatever. But we need a bridge between the world that we're in right now and the world that we want to get to. And so when it comes to labor, for me, unions and worker centers are those bridges that allow people to really think about their labor a little bit differently. And then, so that's kind of like my philosophical, like, this is what a union means to me. How I explain unions to people who I'm organizing with is that, one, it provides you with an opportunity to come up with collective solutions, and it gives you protection. And so to me, those are like the two maybe most like material like gains that you get from a union. But then there's a third one that's really about like the transformational nature of being in relationship with people that you work with a lot more transparency. Because you're going to have to talk about what you're making. You're going to have to talk about how that impacts you. You're going to have to talk about, the uncomfortable conversation that you had with your manager about, your workload or whatever. So there's something that happens, hopefully if we're doing a great campaign, that people start to understand like, oh, like this really, messed up experience that I had is like not just a me thing, like it's an organizational problem. And we need some ways to rectify it. So the union for me is like a place where people can come together and really decide the kind of workplace that they want. And I have never I've never really been so much of an individualist kind of person. So to me, it does make sense. Like, oh, if I want a promotion, like, let's all ask for it. Like there's power in numbers. Like, kind of came easily to me. And the way that the last thing I'll say about how I explain unions to folks is that it is your organization. Like the union is you. The union is not your organizer. Unfortunately, I think a lot of, unions now kind of do function in that way where like, just bring your problems to the organizer or to your rep and they'll take care of it, right? That's not the kind of union that I want to be a part of. And so I am a member of a union right now, UAW, National Organization of Legal Service Workers.
Yeah.
Okay. Listen, UAW is out here just doing it, girl. Like UAW is having a very good organizing streak right now. But so I'm a part of my union. I go to my union meetings. I participate. Like I'm part of the contract negotiations. Like, it's I think it really is going to be what you make of it, and so I always, even when I was a union rep, where my primary role wasn't to organize campaigns, I still really asked people like, what are like even small administrative changes that you would want in your office, and like use that as a way to really help people understand that like what we're trying to get is the power for you to decide. Because who decides now is just your boss. When you have the union, there's that check. It really alters that relationship of power. And so, a question that I learned from someone who trained me around organizing was to ask people, who decides? I had I had to do X, Y, and Z project last minute and I wasn't prepared. Who decided that? Right? Like, did you decide that? Did your boss decide that? Don't you think that you should be able to decide a bit more about your workload?
Hey, y'all. So let's switch gears for just a minute. We talk so much about empowerment of folks of color on this show. And now I want to take a second to talk about our legacy. It's so important that as we're out here doing our thing and making that money, and trying to be the people that we want to be for our communities and families, that we get our estate plan together. And I know estate planning can be overwhelming. We've got your back. Our team is here to guide you every step of the way. Wills for the People is an estate planning practice that prioritizes creating and advancing generational wealth, particularly within families of color and middle-class families. This is because it's so important that we just get started. So, what do you want your legacy to be? And what steps have you taken to ensure that that happens? Take those steps with Wills for the People, where intentional planning meets transformative results. Visit our website for your free consultation at willsforthepeoplega.com. Mention Impostrix Podcast and we'll give you 10% off of your package. All right, I'll see you over there. Let's get back to the show.
That was a lot. I should have got a pen to write, because I'll start with the last thing you said, which was around the decision making. And I'm thinking about my experience with unions. And I imagine that the folks who were active in the union, our officers, did feel as though the union provided some sort of say in decision making. But as, the little person in South Georgia who, barely heard from the union, that was not at all my experience of the union. But also, I was not, an active member of the union. And so, again, like I said earlier, unions, my history with unions has really been kind of benefiting from those material interests that you talked about, around, specifically for me, it was around pay. It was, negotiating the collective bargaining agreement. Usually that was when we would get pay increases. Sometimes they might change the step level for promotions. But down to the day-to-day stuff, I just didn't know that was how it worked or how it can work, during when there's a healthy union. And I think, for folks listening who have an opportunity to be a part of a union or who are part of a union, hopefully this gives you some food for thought. Because for me and my personal experience with unions, it's always been kind of like high level decision making is what unions were for. And I know we hear a lot about UAW, for example, and every time, they're fighting for higher wages at, car plants and stuff like that. And it's inspiring, their activism is very inspiring, but I never felt a connection to that in my, in my work economy, if you will. And so I was also a member of UAW Legal Services Workers because it was a legal service organization, which is always has been just weird to me that we are somehow cousins to auto workers.
I know.
But I'll take it, it's fine. And then the other thing that you mentioned was, at the outset, your philosophical take on why unions. And I really like that. Well, what I heard, I suppose, is the sense of ownership of the labor. And I think when I think about liberation, that's what I think of, is ownership over all things dealing with me. And that each individual, has that, and that we work together to keep that, and that we are working together so that the decisions that we're making and the life or death decisions, the am I eating today or am I not eating decisions, the healthcare decisions, the childcare decisions, all of these like big decisions are community decided, and community is made up by individuals who have ownership over what they can or can't do, and what they can say yes to and what they can say no to. And so that really, really resonated with me. And, brings me to my next question, which is about just how labor unions and the civil rights movement converged or did not converge, because also my limited understanding of unions is that, you know, historically unions were not open to workers of color.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was quite a fight to allow people that look like us to benefit from these protections, and not necessarily, well, let me say, my understanding is it's because the type of labor that we did as folks of color was not labor that unions were basically allowed to form. So I'd love to hear, you know, the actual history from somebody that knows.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You know, like the history, it's like, it's full of contradictions. Yeah, it's full of contradictions. But they're also like, you know, I think at the height of the civil rights movement, there was also a very healthy density of unionism. And so, yeah, like the history, you're absolutely right. The work that Black people did in in the US was stolen, right? Like it's like the labor was stolen. It wasn't valued. It wasn't considered real work. And so the labor movement for a long time was just white people because it was designed for white people. And the process to actually even be recognized as a labor union really reflected this idea that Black people are like not human and their labor is not real. For a very long time, and there continues to be exclusions about the type of workers who can even unionize. Domestic workers and farm workers. Think about it. Domestic workers work in the house, farm workers work in the field. They're excluded, right, under like, you know, national labor law from actually unionizing. So
Still like today.
To this day. To this day. So some sectors of domestic work can unionize, and there are some home care workers who are organized into a couple of unions. But, you know, by and large, that is not permissible, right? Like, so like the big labor law is kind of reflecting the ways that people felt about labor at that time. And that's the really unfortunate and like, you know, just terrible legacy. And so there's that piece. And then there's also, you know, some other contradictions when we think about the ways that segregation was carried out. And I always think of this story. Rosa Parks, you know, in Montgomery, gets, you know, kicked off, you know, and arrested, right? Kicked off the bus and arrested. That bus driver is a union member, right? Mm-hmm. That bus driver's actions are protected by his union, right? And so I think that when we look back at the histories of unions and like what union members have contributed, like, yes, there are some very like powerful stories, you know, like the work that A. Philip Randolph did with sleeping car porters, and really organizing them and organizing that into like a really good job, you know, relatively. Mm-hmm. So there's like that kind of work of like where you see, you know, the pride of being a unionist. And then there's like, you know, the unionists who were like the front lines of, you know, segregation and racial violence. In the integration of labor, I think, you know, is similar to the like integration of schools. Like it brings people into more intimate relationship as peers, because white folks were always close to Black people, but not as peers. So now if I'm in school with you, if I'm at work with you, now I got to be a peer to you. And so it was very difficult, you know, and there were some unions, even in Atlanta, actually. I think there's at one of like the textile plants here. There's a story where they brought some Black women onto the shop floor to work, and the white workers walked out and went on strike. Said we can't work here if there's Black women. If these Black women come into our workplace, it means that our workplace is going to be devalued. So we don't want to be in a workplace that's going to be devalued because you brought these folks in.
Sound like they talking about houses.
Say what?
I said it sounds like they talking about houses.
Right. So I think that there's always that tension within labor. And that was like, that must have been like in the like 60s or something. I don't think it was too long ago. So I do think that there is like this kind of rub between what it means to bring like all workers together and then what it means to like have a union that is kind of holding on to its white identity, this white male identity specifically. And unfortunately, some of the more, traditionally masculinized work, those unions tend to be white and male dominated. Whereas, the teachers and the flight attendants, like those are, usually like women dominated. And so there's a lot of that. But I think where the civil rights movement and the labor movement came together really well, again, back to A. Philip Randolph, who, in a lot of ways did that bridging and was able to really, I think, like connect this piece around like pride and respect and work to like just this overall theme of like dignity for Black people. And under him we got like Bayard Rustin, and then we got like the MLK connecting to labor. So I think that once the connection is made, I think that's when we saw like the movement really grow. And I feel like we kind of need to go back to that right now. We need to go back to really encouraging and making space for, regular Black people who are working to really think about their labor as something that they can leverage collectively to get better conditions. But yeah, I think about that. And then also like, under A. Philip Randolph or like, other Black unionists, there was a lot of like skill and intention and strategy. And, if that movement didn't exist, the March on Washington wouldn't have happened, because I feel like the kind of, to me at least, right, I'm just making a bold statement, but like I think that the discipline that comes from organizing in labor is super necessary in order to like make those kind of large scale movement moments happen. And so there's a lot there to be proud of. And I think that there is something to be said about the point at which Martin Luther King Jr., who, is not perfect, but the point at which, he became the most dangerous, I think is when, he was actually being a lot more visible and supporting unionists and also supporting anti-war activists. So I do think that the idea of Black people becoming unionized en masse is dangerous to this society. And that's why we need to be doing it more,
Oh, yeah. I mean, always, wherever Black people gather.
Absolutely. And especially Black people gathering and getting feeling a sense of ownership of their labor, as much labor as Black people are out here, doing. I mean, it's totally dangerous. So I think that there is that. And then there's also been, some other going back to the people who have been excluded from unionizing, domestic workers. There have been so many incredible labor projects by Black domestic workers. In fact, one of the pivotal moments in that movement was in the late 1800s, where washerwomen in Atlanta were trying to get some sort of intervention from the city council around their pay. And they had a very successful strike. And it was part of a sweep of strikes. Now imagine, slavery has been legislated out just a few years. And Black women are going on strike. Wow. And changing what the Atlanta City Council is doing. So in some ways...
And talk about courage. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but just talking about courage and risk.
Absolutely.
I couldn't imagine, and these white people are probably like, look, literally 2 days ago, you were my property.
Right.
And now you think you somebody.
Right. Exactly. And I think, and that's why it's so dangerous. That's why it's so dangerous. Like, how dare you have, a sense that you're worth something, right? That you're worth everything. Like, how dare you? And so I do think it's really bold. And there are a lot of these bold examples of people coming together around their labor, even if it's not a union, which is why I say that, to me, unions are a means to an end. It's great, super if you have one. And having one doesn't equal that liberation that we are all kind of moving towards. And then the last thing I want to say too is I think the ways in which we think about labor organizing, by and large, the story of labor organizing, I think is really told from a white perspective. I think if we tell the story of labor organizing in the US by Black people, we would start in 1861. Right? We would start by really going back and recognizing that, the work stoppages, the sabotaging, the raids, everything that made the slavery economy unmanageable for all these years, and that forced the North to actually take a position on slavery, that was labor.
Wow.
And W.E.B. Du Bois calls it, I think, the Great Strike. That period, that Lincoln didn't free the slaves stopped working, right? There was a work stoppage. The relationships of labor had to shift, maybe not as much where sharecropping was then instituted,
right?
But it did have to shift. And so I really love when I do trainings on the union, on the history of labor organizing. That's where I start. Because I think if you understand that, then you understand the power of collectivized Black labor, but also the power of collectivized Black labor with other working people too.
Yeah, and I just want to comment for a moment that that's a great example of bringing anti-racism into your work and into the legacy of what you do. Because as you said, labor is told from the perspective of whiteness. And so many of our stories, so much of our history is told through that lens. And I think a lot of times as a consultant, we get questions about, well, what do you mean, being anti-racist in this way, or in our work, or as we're talking to people, or, give me a specific example. So for people who are listening and are and something's clicking for you, this is a great way of just acknowledging, so going deeper than what we know, because we know that our country is built off slave labor, yet we don't talk about that labor whenever we're talking about how great the United States is, and how, our economy and being a world power and the building up of cities and all of this stuff. And so fill in the gaps, do the education and then pass that on. And so I love that you brought that example of no, we start at 1861 and we talk about, this massive strike of enslaved people in the labor. So we have to wrap up here in a second. I want to ask about the work that you do also with queer communities, because I know that you were telling me you recently wrote an op-ed about organizing and queer communities and kind of inclusivity. So can you talk about that? Because I'll say some of what I hear you saying around the way that labor unions have, hold contradiction, and in some cases, not in some cases, were created at the exclusion of people of color. It reminds me of the law and the contradiction that I feel that I hold as a practicing attorney. And so I just wonder, how you help those of us who are in marginalized communities, whether that's by race or queerness or disability, navigate like this contradiction.
Hmm.
And maybe how do you navigate it?
Yeah. So one thing that I kind of hold as a North Star, when I'm thinking about the kind of organizations that I want to be part of or work for, the kind of workplaces that I imagine to be dignified, my measure is, could a woman who is Black, trans, and not English as her first language, like, could that person come in this workplace and have access? Does she have access to this workplace? Can she come here and be comfortable? I think it's important to, and she's disabled too, right? Like, I think that where we often miss the mark as a movement is to not really think about, access and about, in general, like disability justice and gender justice. And so I like to bring that into the work that I do. I'm on a board for Black Worker Center and for an LGBTQ Worker Center. So, and I see them both as doing, the same work, essentially, of trying to create a space for workers who aren't otherwise organized. And in both spaces, I find myself really pushing and being pushed by my peers around disability justice. Because when we think about the ways that labor laws function right now, if you are, the whole marriage equality thing, yeah, gays can get married. Shit, I got gay married before it was federally recognized, just so y'all know. Okay, head of the game. But yeah, and it's kind of like, yes, it's great that people can get gay married, but if you are a person with a disability and you're receiving, money for that, you can't get married because that threatens your benefits. And so people are still excluded from marriage. And I think that when we kind of, focus on like the folks who are able to be the most successful when a law changes, we kind of allow ourselves to be like, I guess, I don't know, just like fooled, and we get away from like the real purpose, which is like, gay marriage, let's be honest, it does not help, a woman who is Black, trans, disabled, immigrant, like, it may not make a material difference, in her life. And so I think what I am really excited about is the ways in which both in queer and trans labor spaces, there is an increasing amount of leadership around bringing disability justice into the work, and also being very clear that Black people are like maybe at the highest rate of becoming disabled. Like, being Black in America is disabling. Being a Black worker in America is disabling. So, like, it is a reality that at some point we are all going to have to face as workers. And that doesn't change, because you make a lot of money. Like, work is disabling. And so I'm really excited by the leadership of people who are kind of moving in the labor movement with that sort of like idea in mind. So yeah, the National Black Worker Center have been doing some great work in creating also a Black Worker Bill of Rights, trying to, create campaigns through which people can actually, institute some of the rights that we believe all Black people deserve, including, and really like all Black people, right? Like we're not doing this, some of us are good, some of us are whatever, like all Black people, people who are incarcerated are having their labor stolen. How are we thinking about that, as being part of our movement? So there's a lot of like, I think that where I think I have been super blessed in my experience in this movement is that I've been doing the labor organizing, but doing it from a place of being rooted and grounded in queer, trans, and Black community. And so I don't know, I just feel so blessed that I get to have perspective, and I'm not just like, let me just go and start a union and blah, blah, but I'm like, no, like, how does this tie into my liberation as a full human?
Right. It means something different with the perspective. And I'm really glad that you shared that perspective with us today, because you said a whole word at the end. I might have to name the episode. Black, what was it? Being Black, working while Black is disabling, or something of that nature. Yeah, But okay, can you share with us your mantra or your affirmation for this time, and then share with us where we can find you if folks want to listen to the podcast.
Okay, so this is an affirmation that I wrote yesterday during therapy. And it reads, I lead with what I want. I deserve to get it. I believe I will get it.
I love it. Thank you. And where can we find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Disciples of Courage. I think, it's just at Disciples of Courage. If that doesn't come up, just add a podcast to it. And then my personal Instagram is at Rwandalicious. I don't post a lot, but it's a very pretty Instagram because it's my creative space. And then you can also stream Disciples of Courage on Spotify, Google Podcasts, really wherever you find your podcasts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, AJ, for joining us. I also just have to note, AJ is wearing a shirt that has knives on it. I just feel like somebody's going to have watched this whole thing and been like, Whitney didn't say anything about that shirt. So it's an amazing shirt and it has knives.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. Feel free to continue the conversation with us over on Facebook at the Impostrix Podcast Validating Space. We welcome all, and it's a space for us to validate each other as we work through work, race, and imposter syndrome. You can find out more about me or about the podcast at www.impostrixpodcast.com. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Impostrix Podcast. Until next time, be validated.